All right. Well, I am pleased to be joined with two nerdy scholar friends, Dr. David Watson of United Theological Seminary and Dr. Ryan Danker of, you are at the, is it the John Wesley Institute?
I am.
Yes, in
True.
Washington, D.C. And we need to be clear, we're talking about the United Theological Seminary of Dayton, Ohio, not the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, just in case. Y'all.
We're in lovely and scenic Dayton, Ohio.
And so y'all have come from Methodism. Y'all are both involved in local church ministry and parachurch and education and all that. And one of the questions I see constantly on Twitter is how awful the UMC is or how wonderful it is and how this and that. And there's been a bunch of historic votes and tensions and drama, which, is very common in churches, I think. But I wanted to have y'all on to discuss two basic things. One is what has led the United Methodist Church, and we'll say broadly Wesleyanism, to where it is now, so the past. And number two is, once that has been assessed, where is it going in the future and where should it go? And so if you guys want to do the rock, paper, scissors for who goes first to the question of what has led us to this point, I'm happy to toss that over to you. Whoever's most sanctified can speak first, so we'll go with that.
Well, that's definitely David.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just kidding.
Now it's definitely
What has led us to this point? It depends kind of on where you want to begin, Nick. I mean, if you want to go back far enough in Methodist history, you could really say that the rapid growth of Methodism early on, we didn't quite know what to do with that. And after a period of time, Methodism lost the commitment to its doctrine, spirit, and disciplines. And so, for example, you get, class and band meetings kind of fall out, and we get Sunday school and stuff like that. But also Methodism became so popular that we became respectable. Now, this is kind of the thesis of my friend Scott Kisker in his book Mainliner Methodist. But what he wants to say is the desire for respectability was really poisonous for Methodism. And from that point, we kind of lost its saltiness, so to speak. And now, I mean, so that's one issue that arose. Now, I'm not saying that happened everywhere. I'm not saying it happened with every church. I'm just speaking about general tendencies. You want to add anything to that part, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, Methodism in America became mainstream in many respects, and I think when that happened, it shifted away from it shifted away from its evangelical roots. We entered the phase of what my friend Leslie Griffith says is mahogany Methodism. And that's kind of, I think, a more fun way to say respectability. But the big downtown churches with the stained glass and et cetera, things that I actually like. But the problem was Methodism lost its energy and its evangelical drive in certain respects when it did that. But I do want to say this, because if you're wondering why we're in the place where we are now, it's because Methodism continued to have an evangelical core, and a segment of it sought after this mainline perspective. And so what you have is the creation of ultimately competing visions of the Christian life. And I'm not saying that stained glass was the issue. That's not it at all. What I am saying is that you have a difference here that emerges, so that you have multiple forms of Methodism that ultimately end up within the United Methodist Church. And I think that's another issue. One thing I would add too, because this isn't just an ideological fight within the church. This is, I think, the repercussion of a system that's failing. And the very creation of jurisdictions, we have to admit, was driven by a racist ideology that set up these supposed barriers between parts of the church. But there's all kinds of systemic failure throughout the entire institution around accountability and other things, and it mainly comes out of a history of problematic ideology, which is it's a sad state, actually, because the church doesn't function well without a good ecclesiology. But that's what I would add to it.
Well, and I do want to say that moving forward in time to 1968, so it's really kind of in the early 20th century that Methodism really began to become respectable. And by the time we get to 68, Methodism is quite large. The merger with the Evangelical United Brethren Church that formed the United Methodist Church in 68. I think a lot of Evangelical United Brethren, former EUBs today, would say that was a mistake, because their tradition was just kind of swallowed up by a much larger Methodist church. Also in 72, we put the first iteration of the so-called Wesleyan quadrilateral into the Book of Discipline. And when we did that, so what that is, in case people watching this don't know, it's the idea that Christians draw upon scripture, tradition, reason, and experience in making theological judgments. Now, to a certain extent, that is true. But what we did in 68 was we kind of stuck them in there with no sense of how they related to one another, and with no sense of the primacy of Scripture. And the text even says in 72, none of these four resources can be defined unambiguously. So we're not even quite sure what any of them mean. And this appeal to these four resources, according to the 72 discipline, was what was really constitutive of being Methodist. It wasn't a confession of faith. So it was a church based not on a common confession, but on an appeal to four resources. And we're not quite sure what all of those four resources actually mean, nor are we sure about how they relate to one another. And so there was a tremendous amount of ambiguity built into the system. But what it was meant to do was it was meant to encode doctrinal pluralism into the Methodist system. Mm-hmm. As Ryan pointed out, we've always had these sort of competing strands within Methodism. But at this point, 50-something years later, after the formation of the United Methodist Church, the two major streams, I think, that have long been present within Methodism have reached a point where it's become impossible for them really to live together. The differences have just become too stark.
Yeah, and I would, we've got 72, but then we have very quickly the evangelical wing reacts.
Well, in 88.
Right. Yeah. Well, they triumph in 88 with a much more solid document called Our Theological Task. Well, it was a revision of 72. And so it does represent those two sides kind of battling it out, as it were. Now, what's unfortunate, of course, is that Albert Outler, when he initially came up with the quadrilateral, I think he actually presented that in his mind to an evangelical church who knew that how this should be used, that's the sad reality of that particular approach, is that, I do want people to know that Outler was sound, but a number of people took that and ran with it. And even when it was corrected in 88, you had people like John Cobb who said, no, this is 4 votes. Each of these gets 1 vote, and that represents a very different form of Methodism.
Yeah. So maybe stepping back a bit, maybe offering just a bit of definition of terms, mainline and evangelical, just for those, because mainline churches, usually people think of Episcopalian, it usually has a set of kind of a theological method to it, a certain kind of social construct, ideas, politics. If you want to just give a little more definitional weight to kind of the evangelical and the mainline aspects of Methodism, just so our listeners can just kind of carry a bit with that.
Well, the mainline traditions, we're usually referring to what are called the Seven Sisters. Okay. And so that's the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Disciples of Christ, American Baptists, and how many is that? I don't know. I've lost count now.
I think
That's
the United Church of Christ would be
United
7.
Church.
yeah, the UCC. Yeah,
UCC.
yeah. So we refer, and these tend to be more liberal traditions, more progressive traditions, although there have always been sort of evangelical pockets within them. And and these were, some of these traditions, I would say all of these traditions have been in decline for some time. Now, evangelicalism is not a denominational tradition, right? But it's kind of a way of approaching the faith. It involves certain commitments. So you can be in these mainline traditions and be an evangelical. And I would say that it involves a high view of Scripture, conversionism, and an emphasis on evangelism. Now, there are more robust understandings. Like there's something called Bebbington's Quadrilateral. If you look up the National Association of Evangelicals, they'll explain Bebbington's Quadrilateral on their website. But what do you think, Ryan? Have I got it right there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Bebbington guy. So, I mean, Bebbington is it's conversionism, it's crucicentrism, right? The idea that the cross is central to that theological tradition and the way they talk. Biblicism, emphasis on Scripture, and then activism. And I think in his case, it's more that the faith will change you, but then it's secondarily activism itself in the way that we think of like the temperance movement or things like that. But I was with the mainline. I think there's a sense. I think evangelicalism has always had a sense that they really aren't accepted by the world. There's always been this us against the world kind of mentality within the evangelical tradition that the mainline simply does not have. And I think a lot of that in America, especially in the mid 20th century, is that the mainline populated the halls of power. And it's interesting if you look at Congress and the number of people from what religious tradition they come from, the mainline is still way overrepresented in terms of the population. So there's this sense that the mainline wants to be in the center of the public square, whereas evangelicalism, while it engages the public square, I think they're a bit cynical about it in certain sense. They don't trust it. I think that's always been a part of the tradition as well. But the other thing about the mainline is their use of the Bible. Within the mainline, higher criticism, which is an approach to Scripture, has had more sway with the leadership. And in evangelicalism, it was simply not accepted. It's not that they don't have
that's changed somewhat now, though, hasn't it?
In some, but it's still not. I don't think it's changed in that it's no longer dominant in the mainline, and I don't think it was ever dominant in the evangelicals.
Yeah, it's weird. At Fuller, I was taught this sort of stuff, but it was always with a historical criticism was viewed critically. It wasn't a method by which you did stuff. It was, here's how this is used, and if there's pieces there that you can work with, fine. But like the pastorals and the authorship question, right? That was always something that was talked about. But even my professors were like, yeah, Paul probably wrote these, and the rule of faith and the canon, all this sort of stuff too. So that's what I see as kind of, at least within evangelicalism, how historical criticism is at least viewed.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking broad terms, like, for instance, in the 1950s, when they came out with the Interpreter's Bible, the original Interpreter's Bible, it was highly Protestant and it was higher criticism throughout. The new Interpreter's Bible, which came out, 20, 30 years ago now. It's 20 years ago, is much more, it is not as engaged and enamored with it. I think that is a difference. But David, you were going to say?
Well, and I think there's another group that we shouldn't forget about that will probably soon eclipse both groups if it hasn't already, and that is the Pentecostal and Charismatic movement. both globally and within the United States. I mean, some people would group Pentecostals and evangelicals together, but I don't think that's not necessarily a good fit. And this is a tradition that's growing very rapidly worldwide, and so we need to be cognizant of what's happening there and pay attention to this tradition and learn from it what we can.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of brings us kind of to the present. And if y'all want to give kind of y'all's thoughts on the, I'm trying to remember the exact year, the vote that Twitter exploded, the internet exploded with the vote that basically what seems to be that brought everything to the surface and out in the public. All the dirty laundry basically exploded out of the laundromat. And so if y'all want to give kind of a quick rundown, that can be kind of the transition point to where is going and should go.
I think you're thinking of 2019.
Yeah.
The 2019 General Conference of the United Methodist Church, where the issue of human sexuality really came to the fore in a way that it hadn't before. It had always been a contentious issue. I mean, really, ever since 1972, it had been a contentious issue, but that had really begun to increase in recent years, particularly in 2016. In 2019, there was a special general conference, and the bishops were really pressing something called the One Church Plan, which would be kind of a local option for churches, pastors, and annual conferences to make decisions about what they thought about same-gender marriage.
So kind of Baptist, right? That sounds like
it is.
Not to be rude about it, but I was like, that sounds pretty Baptist.
My argument about it was this is deeply un-Methodist. But regardless, that's what they were pushing. And then there was also something called the Traditional Plan, which would simply double down on accountability policies within the church and try to hold accountable people who were in violation of the discipline by performing same-sex marriages. And the Traditional Plan passed. And at that point, it was just extremely clear that the denomination could not hold together anymore. People were not going to abide by the decisions that the General Conference had made. And at this point, I would say that the governance of the United Methodist Church has largely fallen apart. And how I'm not United Methodist anymore. I joined the Global Methodist Church, but how it will be interesting to see how United Methodists put that back together, once they regroup after this division of the church is over.
You want me to comment on 2019?
Yes, please.
I mean, it was interesting. I opposed the One Church Plan as well, mainly because Methodists have to have a theology that includes all aspects of life. We're a holiness tradition, whether we want to admit it or not. And so to say that there's certain aspects of life, and in this case, it's like, we'll close off the bedrooms. We don't have an opinion about what goes on there. Is fundamentally not Methodist. I really think, Methodism in its various forms needs to either say, look, we are going to bless this, or we're going to bless this, to be authentically Methodist. And that's what I give kudos to the traditionalists and the progressives, because both the left and the right get this. I think if you want to find Wesleyans in the United Methodist Church, look on the left and the right. That's where they're located. They just have very different views of things. It's the centrists I worry about. Willing to essentially gut Methodism in order to hold together an institution is not the point of Methodism. And of course, now I get it right from Wesley. Wesley was essentially, if it's not promoting holiness of heart and life, there's no point. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here, but that's essentially what he would have said. But 2019, the governance issue, and that's why I went back to, the creation of the jurisdictions made the United Methodist Church ungovernable. We just didn't realize to what extent we had made it ungovernable.
Yeah.
The other problem is we have looked the other way at candidates for decades, candidates for ministry, who will cross their fingers when saying, yes, I believe in the doctrines and discipline of the church. And they'll stand before God in the conference and they'll just, shrug. And the thing is, it's not entirely their fault. We've created a climate in which it's expected that you can simply be willy-nilly about things as long as you toe kind of an institutional line. And what that does, whether you're a liberal or conservative, doesn't matter. It instills a lack of integrity within the clergy. And that's untenable, we haven't got to it yet, but my hope for both progressive and conservative Methodism moving forward is that they both can have integrity. And actually say, yes, I believe this. I will stand by this. And I've worked with liberals and conservatives and centrists and everybody for decades. I wish them all the best, but I want them to have integrity. Is one of the things that really is driving me and my interests. But I'm getting ahead of the conversation here.
No, and that's helpful. It's one of those, I see it in our region as well. American Baptists and all that sort of stuff. Our region is, I'd say, center-right. Most churches are center-right-ish, conservative-ish, very heavily Hispanic and African-American, so those traditions and stuff like that. So it's just interesting to see. I know some ministers that are very, very liberal that would not, if they actually said what they thought, would not have a job in that church. And for example, I'm not naming names or anything, but when I went to a younger ministers conference for American Baptists in Evanston, Illinois, just north of Chicago, and the executive minister of the region, or one of them, I can't remember exactly what his title was, but basically said, we're so divided here, I don't think I could get anyone to sign off on the statement, Jesus is Lord. And this is in a church that when I walked in, I'm like, is this a church or a community center for radical pluralism? It's like you've kind of gutted the idea, as you said, that you've gutted it of what it was intended to be, either left or right. And you just walk in, I'm like, what is this? And I wasn't the only one who thought this, but I mean, there's maybe 30 of us youngins, 40 and under, young ministers, and I'm just looking around going like, where's our sense of identity in this? It's just it's kind of assimilation into culture without culture having to challenge itself. And I don't know, it's just I'm seeing a little bit, obviously they're not identical. Y'all have actual hierarchy and this, whereas American Baptists, we tend to be very flat, which is wonderful and not wonderful. But I don't know, I was amused and heartened and saddened to see very similar things, at least on my end. So,
well, you're right, Nick, that 2019 really was a watershed. It was after that conference that I really, I just said to myself, this, we've got to divide. We've got to divide. And, my leanings are more conservative. And so I knew kind of which way I would go in the divide. But it was a very difficult conference. Just about everyone I knew who left that conference felt really just devastated afterwards, because it was just so clear that the United Methodist Church had kind of fallen apart there. It was a bad public witness for us.
It's horrible.
And I think it was Chris Ritter who tweeted, the people at home can't unsee this. It was really bad. Yeah. So,
even some of the things said on the floor of General Conference, out of the anger and frustration.
Yeah.
I imagine that those people regret their words. Actually, probably regretted it even that day. But we couldn't unsee it, and we can't unhear it. I mean, it was bad.
Yeah. So, when I decided to leave the United Methodist Church, I just wrote a piece about this in Firebrand, but that was a difficult decision. I knew I had to do it, so it wasn't difficult in that way. It was an emotionally difficult decision, because I've never been any other denomination for my entire life. I was baptized as an infant in the United Methodist Church. And so it was kind of leaving home for me. And that was not easy, but I felt like it was what I needed to do. I hope that the folks who stay in the United Methodist church can right the ship and get things going in the right direction. I hope they can repair their governance, but that's going to take a lot of work.
And so we've already kind of hinted at it. You want to say hi? Good job. What is so? Where is it going, and where should it go? So maybe that is from my end. I can see a denomination very often, at least in my experience, tends to get less conservative over time. And I mean, I'm not saying that as a general. I'm saying that very generally. My experience and all that has been with Southern Baptists and seeing them do the fundamentalist takeover, which was its own. It's not identical at all. In fact, what the fundamentalists did was unethical, in my opinion, how they went about the whole thing. But so where do you think the church will go? I mean, you've got the splits happening. You have the global Methodism, you have the African Methodist, you have all these sorts of pieces, if I can say it like that, of what the UMC is and probably is going. So I don't know if y'all can speak into that. Of course, not polishing the crystal ball or knowing, the future, but what are y'all's thoughts on those sorts of things? And are you okay? Okay, we're good.
Brian, you want to go first on this?
Yeah, I can go first. I mean, right now, so the way I look at this is I see that Methodism has entered a period of realignment, and it was always in a place where, at a certain point, given the cultural climate that we're a part of, that is not leaning toward unity. And I think we all have to realize that we're part of the cultural climate, no matter how conservative we say we are. We've entered a period of realignment. There's already, what is it? It's either 1,000 or 1,500 churches have already formally entered the disaffiliation process. And that's not just, that's a lot of large churches too. It's an amazing amount. From what I hear, they're expecting in the next 3 to 4 years, even, assuming that the disaffiliation process has continued that long, that there might be up to 5,000 churches that disaffiliate from the UMC. Now, I think so what we're seeing right now is interestingly enough, it's actually odd because people look at that and say, well, the conservatives are the ones who have the votes at General Conference. Why are they leaving? They're leaving an untenable institution, is what they're doing. They're leaving a situation where they could pass whatever they wanted at General Conference. It just wouldn't actually be enacted by the church in at least in the States. Now, you brought up Africa. Africa is a really interesting thing, and of course, we just recently saw what purported to be a letter from all the bishops of Africa against the Global Methodist Church. I think it's interesting to watch people post that on social media, especially those who have no connection to Africa. But well, I mean, they're completely misconstruing it. So I reached out to Africa. I said, what's going on? and I think what we see there is, I mean, Africa is the United Methodist Church in Africa is not beholden to anybody. First of all, it's amazing how many people insinuate that certain segments of the United Methodist Church in America control Africa, and that is completely wrong. Actually, I think it's
kind of racist, actually, if you think about it.
Yeah, I was trying to be nicer, but yeah.
I'll say it. I've heard enough of my United Methodist friends when 2019 happened saying if it wasn't for Africa, we get what we want. I'm like, so you're colonialists. and I'm not saying all of them, but I had a few people that in anger, and I know they regret it now because in the moment, people say terrible things, but I'm like, careful, friends. Like it's careful.
Yeah. Well, in Africa, the general sense is they're waiting to see what happens at 2024, and they still have hope for the passage of what's called the protocol legislation, which is it's legislation that still pretty much gives the entire barn to the liberal side, but it's legislation that allows the conservatives to get out much more easily. And I think that's what Africa is waiting for, because they are very conservative. If you talk to any of them over there, you'll realize very quickly what they think about these issues. And it's not because anyone told them to think that way. It's because this is what they actually believe. So I don't know. We're going to see a shift. Now, the other thing, and then I'll let David, you can jump in. We're seeing some churches essentially go independent and not join the Global Methodist Church or any other denomination. I think that's to be expected by some during this period, because this is not an easy time, and the reality is they're divorcing from a body of Christians here, and then they're officially independent until they vote to join the GMC or somewhere else. So some of them are taking a breather, it sounds like. I'm also convinced some of them really didn't imbibe a Methodist ethos to begin with, and have essentially created Congregationalist churches. And I think that's unfortunate, because they won't be Methodist for very long. It'll maybe a generation or so, and it won't be there anymore.
Well, I don't think you can really be Methodist without superintendency.
I agree.
And churches that go independent may be great churches, but they're not Methodist. And you can't be Methodist and be an independent church, in my opinion. I know that there are churches that claim to be Methodist that are independent. They're certainly conceiving of Methodism in a way that's different than the way I do. With regard to the future, Africa is a big question mark. I do think that eventually most of the United Methodist churches in Africa will in one way or another affiliate with the Global Methodist Church, but I don't know that for certain. I could also see African United Methodism breaking off as its own thing. I mean, that could very well happen. They are waiting for the protocol to pass in 2024, and whether or not that will happen, I don't know. The Africans may have the votes to do it. Yeah. But we'll see. With regard to Methodism in the United States, I think that that Methodists that continue to sort of latch onto a mainline identity are going to continue to decline. There's nothing to suggest that won't happen. I was reading a book by Ryan Burge called 20 Myths About Religion and Politics in America. I think that's the right title. And he talks about how, I think the year was in the early 1970s. So forgive me if I'm remembering this incorrectly, but in the early 1970s, about 30% of Americans were involved in some type of mainline denomination. And now the number is about 10%. And there are more people with no religion, nuns, N-O-N-E-S, than there are mainline Protestants. Evangelicalism has not grown as a percentage of the population, but it hasn't really declined either. From the early 1970s until now, it still represents, I can't remember the exact number, it was something like 27% of the U.S. population. So that number has stayed steady over time. But that's not going to be good enough moving forward. I mean, churches are going to have to get serious about evangelism, about revitalization, about church planting, apologetics, and other things like this as we move forward, because Christendom in the West has really kind of collapsed in on itself. And so we can't rely on cultural Christianity anymore. There's even, I would say, a real hostility to traditional forms of Christianity in Western culture. And so, if you're interested in that, read the article in First Things magazine by Aaron Renn called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. He talks about how, you do have these three periods, and with the period there was a period where traditional Christianity was looked on quite favorably, a period where it was looked on kind of as it's neither positive nor negative. It sort of has a neutral status. And now he says we're in sort of the negative status period. And so there is an increasing dissonance between cultural Christianity, or between traditional Christianity and sort of the world around us in the West. And that's probably only going to going to be more pronounced as time goes on. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Christianity often thrives with a bit of tension, or sometimes with a lot of tension. So this could actually be good for the church and help us to define who we are as, once again, strangers and aliens. But the main line, I think, is going to continue. There's nothing to suggest that the main line is not going to continue on its current trajectory. The United Methodist Church has declined every year since 1968 in the United States. Now, in other parts of the world, it's grown, but in the United States, it's declined every year since it was formed in 1968. And so I don't know really how you change that trajectory.
Yeah. Well, and my concern for the United Methodists after this period of realignment is if you have a very progressive element and then a centrist element, they're going to be presented with a whole new slate of issues, because those two groups do not agree about some fundamental things. And there will be debates about some fundamental questions of doctrine once the traditionalists are gone. That I'm not saying they're going to become Unitarians. That's, I'm not, there are some people saying all kinds of things, but the reality is a progressive Christianity does not hold to a creedal orthodoxy in the same way that many of the people in the centrist group do. And that's going to be a challenge that's going to be new for them, because, right now, if anybody brought up anything that was, progressive theology at the General Conference, it would be completely shot down. And I'm talking about a core creedal Christianity, but that's not going to be the case anymore. And so that'll be an interesting thing. And actually, I do worry about a number of my friends in the centrist world, and what that means for their local churches, because it gets back to what you were saying. If you have elements of the church that are just universalist, which, by the way, I think is a rampant problem amongst many mainline clergy. You have people who want to take the doctrine of the Trinity and morph it into something that really doesn't correspond with the historic faith, even if they're well-intentioned about it. Or you have, let's not focus on the cross, let's focus on the incarnation, or some of these other things that come out of Protestant liberalism. It really makes evangelism near impossible, because you're not offering the fullness of the faith. In fact, if you put those three things together, right, a kind of a pseudo-Trinitarianism, lowering, giving no focus on the cross, and universalism, there's no reason to evangelize anybody, because you're not even offering salvation. So some of that's going to come to the fore. And like I said, I'm not saying that that's going to become the official position. We have to be careful, because there are people saying all kinds of things right now about both sides. I'd like to get them all together and have a come to Jesus talk with all of them.
Yeah.
So trust me, David's faced some of it. I've even faced some of it from my own friends. I've tried to be the most neutral person on the planet, but
yeah, it's unfortunate, the kind of things that get said, and it's by progressives, and it's by conservatives, and it's by centrists. Yeah. And the Global Methodist Church has got a lot of work ahead of it. The Global Methodist Church hasn't had even a convening conference yet, and we've really got to get that off the ground sometime soon. The Global Methodist Church is at the present governed by the Transitional Leadership Committee or Council. And, in time, we're going to have to establish a real form of governance with conferences and bishops and other such things. And in my opinion, that happens sooner rather than later. There are no problem-free situations in churches. And so I think in the Global Methodist Church, we had to be realistic about the challenges that we face, which are considerable. That's not to say that we shouldn't do them, but they are considerable challenges. I look to what's ahead with excitement. Like, I want to see what God is going to do through this Methodist movement, but I also have no illusions that moving forward in this way is going to be easy.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the GMC, some of the issues are going to be between a more traditional Wesleyan view that includes sacraments and includes church order, and then what I say is a pragmatic American evangelicalism.
Right.
And those two are going to come to a head, and they already are. And I think it's rather unfortunate, because I think it shows that we haven't catechized people in the Wesleyan way. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think there's going to be that temptation towards pragmatism, which in my opinion is poisonous for the church.
Yeah, it's already
but
there.
the other, what I see with friends in other conservative denominations is the temptation towards politicization of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Global Methodist Church will probably have more politically conservative people in it. I would think that at least in the United States, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. But at the same time, we cannot become the Republican Party at prayer. And so we should see what has happened in other conservative denominations as kind of a warning. We're not immune to that kind of thing. And so it could happen to us as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, that's a good word. I think everybody in Methodism right now needs to look at what other denominations have done in their own season of realignment. What did they do well? What did they do horribly? And I always say, look at the Episcopalians and do exactly the opposite. We can do this better. It wasn't many years ago that these other mainline churches went through times of transition, and the problem is, if you make it vitriolic and polemical and difficult, then you produce two opposing groups, if not more. When in reality, these don't have to be opposing groups. There is going to be a new Methodist expression. Will that new expression be able to work with the older expression on things like compassionate care or hurricane relief or things like that? You make that impossible if the way that things are handled makes everyone enemies. And I wish the bishops would hear that. And there's even some bishops who are more conservative who are making it difficult on their churches through the process of disaffiliation, which is just mind-boggling to me. So that's something that goes back to now, but it's important for the future because Methodism is split many, many, many times. In fact, its greatest period of growth was its greatest period of division, which is something that we need to keep in mind. But the divisions that lasted the longest and produced the most, oppositional parties were the ones where they, were against each other rather than treating each other like different expressions of the Christian faith. And I think that's a lesson we need. I thought we'd learned that with the protocol legislation. I don't think we've learned it, and that does sadden me. Makes me sad. Yeah.
And so, final word on Methodism, and maybe a good question or final question in addition to that would be, because I'll have to go in about 5 to 7 minutes. What would Wesley say about what has happened, and what would make Wesley filled with joy, Aldersgate style, at where Methodism could go? Just to give a little bit of historical kind of grounding.
All right, I'll start with that. Wesley would tan our hides. The revival that he and his brother were caught up in was this transatlantic movement of the Spirit that even the brothers and the other major participants never fully understood what was going on. Half the time, it's like they're holding on for just to stay, just to follow after or run after, as he said, the showers of grace wherever they came. And I think but he also said, the Methodists will be all right if they hold to the doctrine and discipline that they've received. And I think that he would probably take every single one of these groups that I've listed out here, and David's listed out here, and he would have critique, and he would give them kudos in different ways. The the conservatives and their emphasis on the scripture and the need for conversion, he would love that. The progressives and their concern for social justice and for the poor, he would love that. The centrists, I know that there are so many centrists who are well-intentioned for caring for people, and he would be appreciative of that. I think he'd have the harshest words for the centrists, however, because he essentially said, if a church government is not producing the conversion of souls, get rid of it. He just had no patience for that kind of thing. Now, and to the evangelicals, I think he would also say, don't forget the sacraments. And don't become independent Baptists as much as, and that's fine. That's a fine tradition. But yeah, that's what Wesley would say. Now, where would he, in a nutshell, but where would he find hope? I think he would find hope in the fact that there are revival fires in Methodism. And that's where he would be, by the way. He would be chasing after those revival fires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I think a lot of American Methodism would be unrecognizable to Wesley.
Oh, absolutely.
And the first thing I think he would tell us to do would be to reorganize ourselves into class and band meetings.
Yeah.
So first, get that personal discipline in place, and other disciplines will follow out of that once you have accountability. I think what would give him hope today is the growth of the Methodist movement globally. Mm-hmm. Methodism is growing around the world today. And, it's part of this great revival that we see happening in the global South. When I go to, I was in a church in a slum of Nairobi called Matare, and I was worshiping there with the congregation. The church was like one large room, kind of large room. That was it, and we were worshiping. And I thought to myself, being here in this space right now is being in the middle of what Christianity really is today. Christianity began in Western Asia and North Africa. For a long time, the center became Western Europe and North America, or for a short time, North America. And now it's moving back east. When I go to Cuba, there's a powerful revival happening there within the Methodist Church. Souls are being saved. Lives are being changed. People are being saved out of all kinds of destructive behaviors. Mm-hmm. So God's moving, right? And all renewal, whether of individuals, the church, or the church universal, is the work of the Holy Spirit. So our job is to pray and discern, and then come alongside the work of the Spirit and what He's doing all over the world. That's what I want to do. I mean, I want to be where God is moving, and I want to be a part of what God is doing. I don't want to get in the way. God forbid I should ever do that. I want to be a part of what God's doing, and God is moving in Methodism all over the world. And even in the United States, I see places where God really is moving. He hasn't forgotten about us. He hasn't abandoned us, and He still loves us. Mm-hmm. And so I'm hopeful about the future. I have some lament about what's happened in the past, but I'm just trying to move beyond that and look ahead. And try to figure out where God is moving and how I can be a part of that work.